Hello everyone, my name is Adam Blocker. Today I'm going to go through what I think is the first step to advancing as a driver in terms of building setups and contributing to a team that builds and works in an open setup series. And in my opinion, it has nothing to do with messing with the actual technical parameters of a setup. The first step is to provide good driver feedback. This is either to your teammates or to yourself. So, if I'm in a team and if I don't know how to build a setup personally, but I can at least, test the setup and say specific things that will point in different setup directions that can help, confirm the opinions of teammates and just contribute to a general setup direction. Um, also, or if you're just doing them yourself, you need to be able to provide feedback to yourself to know what the car is doing so you can make changes. If you don't have good feedback to yourself, then you're lost, basically. So, in my opinion, the first step of feedback, let me go to a representative corner or easy, is breaking down a corner into phases um, and giving feedback on each phase. So I'll just go through and name what I consider the phases. You can obviously divide it up differently, but um, so first you have I'm full throttle on the straight. The first part of the corner is the initial brake application. So the initial brake application is where you transition from full throttle to threshold braking. So it's just that sudden weight transfer. That's it. Initial braking application. Um, so you might complain here. This is a transient behavior. So all of the things I'm going to talk about, I'm mainly going to divide into transient behaviors and steady state behaviors. So because it's a transient behavior, it's mostly to do with how fast things happen, not really as much the balance of the car. Well, in this particular case, just because you're straight line braking. So, you know, things you normally would complain about on initial braking application is um, maybe the car pitches too much. So, like if you're going too much on your nose, you might lose rear traction. So maybe you're in wheel hop, like rear locking on initial brake application. Maybe you're getting a bunch of front locking on initial brake application. That's normally the two things that happen. Sometimes the car could, you know, do other weird things like pull to one side or just feel unstable on initial brake application. Um, so it's typically things like that you're trying to notice. Obviously, first with all these things, first I try to try a couple different braking styles, like maybe ease into the brakes. Like you see here, I've got into the brakes very aggressively, um, but you know maybe you could try easing into the brakes a little bit more just to see if it goes away. But obviously, you don't want to do it too much because then you're sacrificing time. So I always try to drive in the way I prefer, maybe with some slight modifications that I try to take a mental note of. Um, because even if I'm able to drive something, if I'm still having to trying to drive around something, I try to take a mental note of it to see, if I can fix it or if we can fix it to make it better. But yeah, so there's initial brake application, and then after you've transitioned into threshold braking, the next step is threshold braking. Threshold braking is where you are braking in a straight line and basically you're braking at the tractive capacity of the tires, so longitudinal tractive capacity. So um, you're just braking until you lock up. You try not to lock up. Um, it's pretty simple. Most of the time, the only thing that really is a factor under threshold braking is brake bias, and also weight balance, weight distribution. So maybe ballast and also rake. um, are factors, but the main thing normally, is just if you're locking a rear, if you're locking a front, stuff like that. It's not really too complex in terms of driver feedback. Um, and then after that, there is turn in. I went too far back. There is turn in. So here, where I ease off the brakes, and when you ease off the brakes, the weight is shifting backwards, so it's a pretty transient behavior. And at the same time, the weight's shifting backwards. Well, immediately after, I'm starting to turn the wheel in. So there's two transient behaviors in one here. There's weight shifting backwards, and there's roll being introduced in the car. So in this case, weight is being shifted from left to right. And so typically on turn-in, you're going to, in a lot of transient behaviors, you're going to describe the car as either, the best ways to describe the car are either, sluggish or too responsive. So like maybe typically if the car gets unstable, like if I turn in and I get like a four-wheel slide or some sort of, like oversteer or something dramatic, then typically that means, that's over responsiveness. And then sluggishness is typically like a little bit of like if I turn in and just nothing happens, like if I don't have if I get some understeer and then all of a sudden the car, grips up, then, it's probably, most people say sluggish turn in or understeer on turn in, one of the two. And, a similar thing, sometimes the turn in point and getting off the brakes are a little bit separated. In most cases, they're pretty on top of each other, but, you might also, have a thing with that. But, so typically, like, kind of like I was saying before, typically in these really transient portions, like the initial brake application and the initial turn-in, it's mostly a damper-related thing because dampers are controlling the rates at which everything is transferring weight. So typically, dampers and maybe things like spring rate are, because spring rate also affects damping. But things like that are important. But yeah, so that's the next phase of the corner. And then this corner doesn't have it as much, but in between turn-in, after turn-in, there's sometimes a steady-state trail braking phase where, you just have a little bit of brake-in and no throttle. Like, for example, this corner, you can see down here that after I turn in, I'm just leaving maybe 5-10% brake in. It's important to distinguish, if you have a little bit of brake on or if you don't have a little bit of brake on. Sometimes it doesn't make a difference setup-wise, but it's important to take note of all those things. So if you make a change, you're understanding what you're trying to change, and then if your change is successful or not, basically you're building up experience, right? If you just go and don't really understand what you're trying to change and make a random change, you're not really going to learn anything. If you say, I have a little bit of, sluggishness on turn-in, and then after I turn in, when I'm on the brakes, the car rotates a little bit more than I would like. If you start getting into that sort of detail, then for one, you become more observant, and you might actually better your driving because you're paying more attention to all the details behind your driving style and in the corner, and you're starting to understand the driving mechanics more. But then also, if you make a change, like I said, you can pinpoint a little bit more, if it was positive or negative, and start to build up a memory bank of, of what changes do what, basically, and also what you want the car to feel like in each phase. That's also a really important thing. You have to learn sort of what you want in each phase in order to say, whether something is good or bad, or what you like and don't like about it. So there's a lot of things that goes into it. But yeah, so after the trail braking phase, there's the coast phase. Not every corner has one, but like this one does, where I'm completely off brake and off throttle, just steady state turning. Um, so this is like a phase that I would very much call steady state, like I said. So, you know, any phase that where you're not really having a major input in either the pedals or the steering wheel, I pretty much call steady state. Um, and steady state behavior means basically you might as well throw the dampers out because it has nothing to do with them, and it's just some steady state balance thing, either weight distribution, rake, springs, tire pressures, you name it, right? Um, Wing angle. Um, in steady state conditions, especially mid corner, it's very important to note, um, and really this goes for all the phases, but it especially matters for this mid corner phase. It's important to note whether a particular behavior is happening at slow speed or high speed. So like, if something's happening in like second gear here in left field when I'm going 65 miles an hour, that's way different aerodynamically from what's happening when I'm going 160 through cops. So basically, if I can figure out, okay, if the car has a good balance at high speed, but maybe a little bit of understeer at low speed, then um, you know, I can pinpoint that, and then that helps me decide whether the problem is a chassis problem or an aero problem, basically, um, or both. It could help me, say, there's a little bit of both going on or whatever. But um, obviously high speed being more of an aero effect, and the same thing even goes with braking. You can have different braking characteristics when you're trying to brake at like 70 miles an hour than 160 miles an hour. Um, so. But anyway, the next phase of the corner is your initial throttle application. So this point where I'm just tipping into the throttle and the weight shifting backwards, there's that. So some people call it tip in, some people call it initial throttle application, whatever. Um, Again, that's a transient behavior. That's mostly a damper thing. Then there's the power limited phase. Let me go to the next corner because it's a little bit simpler to break this. So then there's the traction limited phase of power application. So that's where I'm on throttle, mostly part throttle, right? Basically, the traction limited part of accelerating out of a corner is where if you went to full throttle, you'd spin the tires, right? It's where you're limited by the traction in the tires. So that phase, and then once I go to full throttle, I'm power limited, right? Because at that point, I have no wheel spin, and I'm just limited by how fast, how fast I'm going is dictated by how much power I have and my gearing, basically. So and drag and stuff like that. Um, so those are the main phases of the corner. Like I said, the main things are breaking down to high speed, low speed corners. Then also you know uh, whether the behavior is happening during an input or immediately after an input, so transient behavior or steady state behavior. And then other big things to note are stuff like curb strikes. So here, if the car is feeling fine here during this coast slash, a little bit of maintenance throttle phase, pretty much a steady state behavior, then that's, but then when I get on this curb, it does something I don't like, you know, maybe I can't do anything about it because, this car, it's kind of hard to deal with a lot of curb behavior because it's just so low, but maybe, maybe I can do something about it. Maybe I can change high-speed dampers. Maybe I can change spring rate. Maybe I can change ride height to make it ride the curb better. But noticing if the car is doing something over a curb or a bump is pretty big. For example, like the left-hander at Watkins Glen after the carousel, there's a big seam there that has a bump, and I know before I've gotten a lot of turn-in oversteer there, and it would happen intermittently, right? And I was trying to figure out, why it was happening, and then I went a lot of times for this stuff, it helps to go off board and just watch, right? And I could see the car being upset by a bump there. And so then I start going through log data and seeing, okay, it's, you know, I think it's grounding a lot. And so basically like going off board and then seeing that there's a bump completely changed my interpretation of what was happening. So it's important to notice whether, um, you know, things like curbs and bumps. Another big thing, which isn't really the case at Silverstone, is to notice like elevation changes. So and camber of the road. So if you have a corner that's positively banked, like an oval turn or something similar to that, then your car is gonna typically rotate better than if you have a corner that's negatively banked. For example, there's that hairpin at Spa, like a little after Lake Home, that has that where it's that right-hander, it's off camber. It's like, yeah, I have understeer through that corner, and that's the only place I have understeer. Maybe that's normal because that's just the nature of that corner, right? It's so off camber that you can't do that much about it, right? So it's important to notice things like that. And then, like I was saying, also elevation change. So, for example, at Barber, right, the before the last two corners, there's a fast left right. Then you go over that crest, right? Obviously, going over that crest while you're trying to reduce steering lock and putting on power makes the rear go light, and you can spin there, and a lot of it's just because of the track nature. So, um, and you could do some things with setup to try to put more weight in the rear there, but it's important to take note of those things so that you can at least say that this behavior is fundamentally different from a different corner where you don't have this, right? So, and sometimes that's why it's useful, if I'm struggling with a particular corner, just go off board and watch, if something weird's happening there. And even like in left field here, uh, I noticed that if I stayed, off the curb, the car would behave differently than if I put two wheels on the curb and got to, you know, and it's important to note those things. And is it important to be on the curb there, or could you live without being on the curb? Can you set up either way, or what do you want, right? It's important to note all those things. Yeah, another thing I haven't mentioned yet that also affects the balance of the car throughout the corner is where you are in the RPM range. So um, typically, the higher in the RPM range, the more responsive the engine is going to be, and the more torque output it's going to give. So that's both negative and positive torque. So when you're in the braking zone and the coast phase of the corner, if you're at a high RPM, then you're going to be getting more engine braking, and that means more braking to the rear wheels, which has the same effect as going rearward on brake bias. You get a little more oversteer, right? And same thing coming out of the corner. If the higher in the RPM range you are, the more power you're going to be making, and the more likely you are to slip tires or, um, you know, uh, get a little bit of oversteer, right? And so there's a couple things to note with this, right? If you have two corners that are very similar in terms of, you know, how they should drive, but they drive differently, maybe, look at where you are in the gearing and everything. If you're in different parts of the RPM range, that might explain why the balance of the car is a little bit different. Um, and sometimes, simple things like, changing the length of a gear can have a pretty dramatic effect on how the car is doing. Also, I mean, maybe another option is, looking at that, you might try a corner in a higher or lower gear to change that behavior, right? Without changing your actual setup, just changing your driving. Other things to look at with gearing are um, if you have any, like sometimes if you downshift at a time where you're really traction limited at the rear, like on corner entry or on corner exit, it can cause the rear tires to break loose. Um, like you can either get a little bit of locking from that that can unsettle the car, or a little bit of extra wheel spin from the gear re-engaging. So that's something to be to pay attention to. And sometimes you might spin because of a gear shift. So it might be better to, if it's a downshift, maybe delay your downshift or change where you're downshifting. And then if it's upshift, maybe change your gearing so you're not upshifting there, or just try to be pointed straighter when you upshift. Um, yeah. So then the thing I have to say is, from a setup perspective, you always want to look at the corner from entry to exit, because everything that happens early in a corner, everything that happens early in a corner affects everything after it. So if I have a little bit of understeer on turn in and I miss an apex, and then I have not enough rotation at the apex, and then I need to do more rotation on the exit, so I have more steering lock in when I'm applying the throttle and I spin or something. Some people will say, you have oversteer on corner exit, you need to, that's the problem. When really the problem could be, you know, the understeer on turn in that affects everything after it, right? And so maybe if I, fix the understeer turn in, I have a better balance mid corner because I'm not trying to turn as much, and then I have a better balance on exit because the car is straighter. So, you know, all the phases I was saying in the corner, if you're having troubles with the corner, go through in order from entry to exit. Um, so when I'm building a setup, unless the car is absolutely undrivable, I never worry about the exit at first. From a setup perspective, obviously from a driving perspective, you want to think about the exit of the corner whenever you're driving and prioritize that in a lot of cases. But we're talking about strictly from a setup perspective. Um, yeah, and so that's sort of the gist of what I had to say about driver feedback, and I plan on making more videos, hopefully on road setup parameters, oval setup parameters, and just general setup parameters for the IndyCar. Um, yeah, just let me know if you have any feedback on the video. Just feel free to reach out, message me, post in the forum, whatever. Um, what you want, any questions, things like that. I'll try to answer them, or I'm sure others will try to answer if you post it publicly. Um, yeah, so see you guys next video, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it.